Security risk. That's what they labeled her. Two words that would change everything for Skyline Airways. The recycled air of the Boeing 777 hummed with the familiar drone of a cross-country flight preparing for departure. John F. Kennedy International Airport buzzed with its usual symphony of announcements, rolling luggage, and hurried conversations. Gate B-42 was particularly crowded this Thursday morning as Skyline Airways Flight 372 to Los Angeles prepared for boarding. For most passengers, it was just another day of travel, a means to an end. For Jasmine Reynolds, however, this flight represented the beginning of something extraordinary. At 18, she had secured a prestigious summer internship at Hartwell & Morrison, one of the most innovative architectural firms in the country. This flight wasn't just taking her to Los Angeles, it was carrying her toward her future. She stood in the priority boarding line, her simple canvas backpack slung over one shoulder, a small leather-bound sketchbook clutched in her hands. Unlike the business travelers around her with their polished shoes and pressed suits, Jasmine wore comfortable jeans, a plain navy hoodie, and white sneakers. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her face free of makeup except for a touch of lip gloss. She was checking her boarding pass one last time when the gate agent called for first-class passengers to begin boarding. As she stepped forward, she felt a slight brush against her shoulder as a man in an expensive suit pushed past her to be first on the plane. She didn't react, just took a small step back and waited her turn. What Jasmine couldn't have known, what no one at Gate B-42 could have possibly anticipated, was that in exactly 47 minutes, this ordinary boarding process would transform into a public humiliation, and that in less than 2 hours the same aircraft that she was about to board would return to this very gate under extraordinary circumstances. They had no idea the storm they were about to unleash. Jasmine settled into seat 14A with practiced ease. The window seat offered her both privacy and a view to things she valued greatly. She tucked her backpack under the seat in front of her, careful to ensure it didn't encroach on the neighboring space. Her sketchbook, however, remained in her hands. Opening to a fresh page, she began to sketch the curve of the aircraft wing visible through her window. Her strokes were precise, confident. Architecture wasn't just a career aspiration for Jasmine. It was a calling. She saw the world as a collection of lines and spaces problems waiting for elegant solutions. A memory surfaced. She was 7 years old, sitting cross-legged on the floor of her father's study, carefully constructing a cardboard city, while he reviewed quarterly reports. He'd paused his work, knelt beside her, and studied her intricate design with genuine interest. "You see things differently, Jazz," he'd said, his deep voice warm with pride. "Most people just see buildings. You see the spaces between them, how they connect, how they breathe." That moment had crystallized something for her. The understanding that her passion wasn't just about structures, but about how those structures shaped human experience. Dominic Reynolds had never been the type of parent to push his daughter into the family business. When Skyline Airways had grown from a single leased aircraft into one of the country's premier airlines, many had expected his only child to follow in his footsteps. But Dominic had recognized Jasmine's passion early and nurtured it without pressure. That was why this internship meant so much. She had applied without using her family name, submitted her portfolio like every other candidate, and earned her spot based solely on talent. In fact, Hartwell & Morrison had no idea they had just hired the daughter of one of the most influential men in American aviation. Jasmine preferred it that way. She had grown up watching how people changed around her father, how their smiles grew wider, their laughs louder, their compliments more effusive. She had no interest in that kind of deference. She wanted to earn her place in the world, not inherit it. As the cabin filled around her, Jasmine adjusted her noise-canceling headphones and lost herself in her drawing. The gentle instrumental playlist that filled her ears blocked out the chaos of boarding. The lead of her pencil captured the elegant engineering of the wing, the interplay of metal and sky. In her sketchbook, she found a pocket of peace amid the frenetic energy of air travel. Her phone vibrated with a text from her father. "Wheels up yet, call when you land." "Proud of you, Jazz." She smiled, typing back a quick "will do." "Love you," before returning her phone to airplane mode. Her father worried more than he admitted. Since her mother's death 5 years ago, their bond had only strengthened. They were different in many ways. He was outspoken and commanding where she was thoughtful and observant, but they shared a core of quiet determination. The memory of her mother brought a familiar ache. Diana Reynolds had been Jasmine's first architectural influence, a civil engineer whose elegant bridge designs had won international recognition. "Buildings house people," she used to say, "but bridges connect them. Always design with connection in mind." Jasmine returned to her sketch, adding details to the wing's edge. Travel had always been a constant in her life. She had grown up in airport lounges and hotel suites watching her father build his empire. But this was different. This was her journey, her achievement, her future taking flight. The internship in Los Angeles wasn't just a summer position. It was the first building block in her own architectural masterpiece. The cabin continued to fill the overhead bins, closing one by one. Jasmine remained in her bubble of creativity and anticipation, unaware that her carefully planned journey was about to take a devastating detour. "Excuse me. That's my seat." The voice cut through Jasmine's music, sharp and insistent. She looked up to find a woman standing in the aisle, gesturing impatiently at the middle seat beside her. Jasmine slid her headphones down around her neck. "I'm in 14A, Jasmine clarified politely, indicating her window seat. "I know that," the woman said with a tight smile. "I'm 14B. Elizabeth Parker was the kind of woman who commanded attention. In her mid-40s, she wore an impeccably tailored blazer, designer jeans, and loafers that probably cost more than some people's monthly rent. Her blonde hair was cut in a precise bob, and her makeup was flawless. The wedding ring on her finger featured a diamond large enough to catch the overhead lights. As Elizabeth settled into the middle seat, she immediately claimed both armrests with a proprietary air, her elbows firmly establishing territory. She pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly, her acrylic nails clicking against the screen like impatient taps on a countertop. "I usually fly business class," she announced, to no one in particular. "But my assistant botched the booking. Honestly, good help is impossible to find these days." Her voice carried the cultivated accent of someone who had worked hard to erase any regional traces, polished, precise, deliberately neutral, yet somehow still conveying superiority with every syllable. Jasmine nodded politely, then turned back to her window, sliding her headphones back into place. But the boundary between their seats seemed to grow thinner by the second. Elizabeth's elbow kept nudging against Jasmine's arm. Her perfume, something expensive and overwhelming, seemed to invade the small space between them. 10 minutes into boarding, a young Hispanic man approached row 14. "I think I'm in 14C, he said, holding up his boarding pass. "Of course you are." Elizabeth sighed dramatically, standing up to let him into the aisle seat. Her tone carried the exasperation of someone who viewed his very existence as an inconvenience to her travel plans. Miguel Ramirez was around 21, with a backpack that proclaimed him a student at UCLA. He wore glasses and a slightly nervous expression as he squeezed past Elizabeth to take his seat. He nodded a greeting to Jasmine, who returned it with a small smile. As Miguel settled in, Jasmine noticed him pull out a heavily annotated copy of Structures or Why Things Don't Fall Down, the same engineering text she'd devoured during her freshman year. She was about to comment on it when Elizabeth shifted pointedly in her seat, creating a deliberate physical barrier between them. Elizabeth glanced at her watch, a rose gold Cartier that glinted under the cabin lights. Then at her phone, then at the still boarding passengers with increasing irritation. Her body language screamed impatience, as if the normal boarding process was an affront to her specifically. "I have a crucial meeting with Northrop Grumman's board at 4, she announced to no one in particular, her voice pitched to Carrie. Their acquisition strategy for next quarter depends on my presentation. This delay is completely unacceptable." A flight attendant passing by offered a placating smile. "We're boarding ahead of schedule, ma'am. We should push back from the gate right on time." Elizabeth's response was a dismissive huff followed by more aggressive typing on her phone. When Jasmine reached down to retrieve her water bottle from her backpack, Elizabeth flinched visibly as though Jasmine had made a threatening move. "Could you please be careful?" Elizabeth's voice had an edge to it. That almost hit me. Jasmine looked at her in confusion. The water bottle hadn't come anywhere near the woman. "I'm sorry," she said anyway, taking a small sip before returning the bottle to her bag. Elizabeth turned away, but not before Jasmine caught the look of distaste on her face. It was a familiar expression, one Jasmine had seen countless times in upscale restaurants, high-end stores, and exclusive hotels. It was the look of someone who had made assumptions based solely on her appearance, her age, her race. Miguel in seat 14C seemed to sense the tension. He buried himself deeper in his book, his body language clearly communicating that he wanted no part of whatever was happening beside him. As the final pre-boarding announcement came over the PA system, Jasmine caught a glimpse of Elizabeth's open email on her phone, a draft to someone named Walter Whitley, with the subject line, "Urgent Diversity Initiative Concerns." The irony wasn't lost on Jasmine. The flight attendants began their final cabin check. Jasmine returned to her drawing, trying to recapture the sense of peace she'd felt earlier. But Elizabeth's presence had disturbed something, created a ripple of unease that wouldn't quite settle. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. Skyline Airways Flight 372 with service to Los Angeles," came the announcement over the PA system. "We're just waiting for final clearance from the tower and then we'll be on our way. Flight time today will be approximately 5 hours and 45 minutes. As the cabin prepared for departure, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that Elizabeth Parker was watching her, evaluating her, finding her wanting in some undefined but critical way. She had no idea just how right she was. The plane had just pulled away from the gate when Elizabeth raised her hand, signaling for a flight attendant with an imperious wave. A woman in her late 30s with a tight blonde bun and a name tag reading Heather approached. "How can I help you, ma'am?" Elizabeth leaned forward, lowering her voice to a stage whisper that was clearly meant to be overheard. "I'm feeling very uncomfortable with my seating arrangement. This person next to me is making me feel unsafe." The word hung in the air like a grenade with its pin removed. Unsafe. A loaded term that transformed Jasmine from a fellow passenger into a potential threat. Jasmine's head snapped up from her sketchbook, her eyes widening in shock. She hadn't spoken a single word to Elizabeth since the brief exchange during boarding. Unsafe Heather Davidson repeated her gaze, darting to Jasmine with new scrutiny. "In what way?" Ma'am Elizabeth gestured vaguely toward Jasmine's backpack. "She keeps reaching into her bag and she seems agitated. Very hostile when I sat down." Hostile Jasmine found her voice keeping it level despite the absurdity of the accusation. "I've barely spoken to you." Elizabeth recoiled slightly as if Jasmine's words themselves were a form of aggression. "See?" she said to Heather. "That tone. I have a very important meeting in LA with Whitley and Associates, and I simply cannot be subjected to this kind of stress." Heather's expression shifted, her professional smile hardening into something more vigilant. She addressed Jasmine directly. "Ma'am, I need you to remain calm." The instruction felt like a slap. Jasmine was calm, far calmer than most people would be when falsely accused. She took a deep breath, holding up her sketchbook as evidence. "I've just been sitting here drawing. I haven't done anything wrong." Heather ignored the sketchbook. Her voice took on an edge of authority. "I understand, but we need to ensure all passengers feel comfortable and safe." Jasmine noticed Miguel in 14C shrinking further into his seat, his eyes now fixed on his book, his body language screaming disengagement. He was witnessing everything, but had chosen silence. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Heather asked Jasmine, her tone making it clear this wasn't a request. Jasmine reached for her phone to pull up the digital boarding pass. As she did, Elizabeth gasped dramatically. "She's going for her phone. She might be recording me without consent." Heather's posture stiffened immediately. "Ma'am, are you recording? That would be a violation of our in-flight policies during the safety-sensitive phase of flight. No, my boarding pass is on my phone. You just asked for it." Jasmine held up the screen showing the Skyline Airways boarding pass clearly displayed. By now, passengers in nearby rows had begun to notice the interaction. Some were openly staring, others pretending not to listen while clearly hanging on every word. Elizabeth pressed her advantage. "I think she should be moved. Or I should be. This is becoming hostile and I don't feel safe." Heather's decision was already made. "I'll get my lead flight attendant." As she moved toward the front of the cabin, Jasmine sat in stunned disbelief. What had just happened? How had a normal flight deteriorated so quickly into this? She glanced at Miguel, hoping for some acknowledgement, some support, but he remained steadfastly focused on his book. Elizabeth sat with a slight smile playing at the corners of her lips, like someone who had just successfully sent back an unsatisfactory meal at a restaurant. Within minutes, a second flight attendant approached. Her name tag read, Rachel Collins, lead flight attendant. Her expression was already set in grim determination, her mind seemingly made up before she even reached row 14. "What seems to be the problem here?" Rachel asked, though her attention was focused squarely on Jasmine. Before Jasmine could speak, Elizabeth jumped in. "This woman is behaving erratically. I expressed concerns for my safety, and she became confrontational. I'm a Diamond Elite member, and I've never experienced anything like this on Skyline before." Rachel nodded as if this confirmed something. "Ma'am," she said to Jasmine, "I'm going to need you to gather your belongings. We're going to find you another seat." Jasmine felt a cold wave of dread wash over her. "There's been a misunderstanding. I haven't done anything wrong. This isn't a discussion about wrong or right," Rachel replied, her voice lowered but firm. "It's about ensuring a comfortable environment for all our passengers. Now please gather your things." As Jasmine reached down for her backpack, her phone slipped from her lap and fell to the floor. When she bent to retrieve it, Rachel's hand shot out to grab her wrist. "What are you doing?" Rachel demanded. "My phone fell. I'm picking it up," Jasmine explained, holding up the device to show that the screen was locked. Elizabeth seized the moment. "She's filming?" "I knew it. That's a federal offense." "I'm not filming anything." Jasmine protested, but she could see her words falling on deaf ears. The narrative had already been written, the roles assigned Elizabeth the victim, Jasmine the aggressor, the flight crew, the protectors of order. Rachel's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. "This is becoming a security issue. I'm calling the captain." The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed. What had been routine air travel was now charged with tension. Rachel spoke into the aircraft phone, her voice low but urgent. Jasmine could only catch fragments. "Passenger in 14A. Uncooperative. Security concerns." Jasmine sat perfectly still, her sketchbook now closed on her lap, her hands visible on the armrests. She was acutely aware of the eyes on her, some curious, some judgmental, all watching to see what would happen next. A new voice came over the PA system, deep and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain James Wilson speaking. We're experiencing a slight delay. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened. We'll be underway shortly." The aircraft had stopped taxiing and now sat motionless on the tarmac about 200 yards from the runway threshold. Rachel returned, accompanied by a man in a Skyline Airways uniform with a badge that identified him as Thomas Brooks' gate agent. The incongruity struck Jasmine. They had already left the gate. How had a gate agent boarded a moving aircraft? Later, she would learn he had been performing a weight and balance check and was already aboard when the situation erupted. Ma'am Thomas addressed Jasmine with cold professionalism. "I need you to come with me." "Why?" Jasmine asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I haven't done anything wrong. This woman falsely accused me, and no one has even asked for my side of the story." Thomas glanced at Elizabeth, who was now playing the role of the victimized passenger to perfection, her body language suggesting she was enduring some terrible ordeal. "We have procedures for these situations," Thomas replied, avoiding Jasmine's direct question. "And right now those procedures require you to deplane so we can sort this out." "Deplane?" Jasmine echoed incredulously. "We're on an active taxiway." "How exactly am I supposed to deplane?" Thomas's expression hardened. "The captain has requested a return to gate for a security issue. Once we're back at the gate, you'll need to exit the aircraft." "Security issue?" "I'm not a security issue." Jasmine's voice rose slightly despite her efforts to remain composed. "I'm a passenger with a valid ticket who has done absolutely nothing wrong." This slight elevation in volume seemed to validate the crew's concerns. Rachel and Heather exchanged knowing glances as if Jasmine's perfectly reasonable response somehow confirmed their suspicions. Thomas lowered his voice to what he clearly thought was a de-escalation tone, though the condescension only made it more inflammatory. "Ma'am, becoming confrontational is only making this worse. The captain has final authority on this aircraft, and he has determined that you need to deplane. Now you can do so cooperatively, or we can involve Port Authority police." The threat hung in the air. Jasmine glanced around, seeking some ally, some witness who might speak up. Her gaze fell on Miguel, who was now openly watching, but quickly averted his eyes when she looked at him. "Miguel," she said quietly, "you've been sitting here the whole time. Did you see me do anything threatening?" Miguel looked panicked at being addressed directly. He glanced at Heather, at Rachel, at Thomas, at the surrounding passengers, anywhere but at Jasmine. His throat worked as he swallowed nervously, his conscience visibly battling with his instinct for self-preservation. I don't want to get involved," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. But even as he said it, something in his expression conveyed shame, the recognition that his silence was a form of complicity. Elizabeth seized the opportunity. "No one wants to get involved because they're afraid of you," she claimed. "That's why we need security." The accusation was so outlandish that Jasmine almost laughed, but she caught herself. Showing any emotion now would only be used against her. "I'll come with you," she said to Thomas, her voice calm and measured. "But I want it on record that I'm doing so under protest. I have done nothing wrong." Thomas nodded curtly. "You can file a complaint through customer relations." As Jasmine gathered her backpack and sketchbook, she felt a profound sense of injustice washing over her. She had been in this situation before being treated with suspicion for simply existing in spaces where people like Elizabeth felt she didn't belong. But never had it escalated to this level, never in such a public setting, never with such complete disregard for her dignity. The cabin had fallen silent as she stood. Every eye was on her as she stepped into the aisle. Some passengers had their phones out recording the scene. Jasmine kept her chin high, her gaze forward, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her humiliation. As she passed the first-class cabin, she noticed a woman in seat 2B watching intently. Unlike the others whose faces showed curiosity or judgment, this woman's expression was different, assessing analytical as if she were taking mental notes of every detail. A gold pen that peeked from her suit pocket had the logo of a prominent law firm. Thomas led her to the front of the aircraft. The door had been reopened, and 2 Port Authority officers stood waiting on the jet bridge. "This is a misunderstanding," Jasmine said, one final attempt at reason. "If someone would just listen." "Save it for customer relations," Thomas interrupted. "These officers will escort you to the terminal." As she stepped off the aircraft, the door closed behind her with a heavy final sound. In less than 15 minutes, she had gone from being a promising architectural intern on her way to a dream opportunity to being treated like a criminal escorted off a plane by police. and as the jet bridge stretched before her leading back to the terminal she had so recently departed, Jasmine Reynolds felt something hardening inside her, a resolve that wouldn't be broken by this injustice. They had no idea who she was, but more importantly, they had no idea who her father was. "Miss, we need to keep moving," said the taller of the two Port Authority officers, his voice neither harsh nor kind, simply procedural. Jasmine nodded, clutching her sketchbook to her chest like armor as they led her down the jet bridge. The tunnel seemed longer now, stretching endlessly toward the terminal, each step another measure of her humiliation. The officers flanked her, their presence declaring her status to everyone they passed. She wasn't a passenger anymore. She was an incident, a security concern, a problem to be managed. "Can you tell me what happens now?" Jasmine asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "You'll be escorted to the supervisor's desk," the second officer explained. "They'll take your statement and determine next steps." Next steps. As if her life, her internship, her carefully laid plans were just a procedural matter to be processed according to some unseen flowchart. They emerged into this bustling terminal, and Jasmine felt the weight of curious stares from waiting passengers. A young child pointed. A mother quickly pulled the child's hand down, whispering a reprimand while stealing her own glance at the spectacle. The sensation wasn't entirely new. Jasmine had grown up as Dominic Reynolds' daughter, accustomed to a certain level of public attention. But this was different. This wasn't respectful recognition. It was suspicious scrutiny. That's her, the one they took off the plane. Someone whispered loudly enough to be heard. A memory surfaced, sharp and painful. She was 13, shopping with her mother in an upscale boutique in Manhattan. Diana Reynolds had stepped away to take a business call, leaving Jasmine browsing alone. Within minutes, a security guard had appeared asking pointed questions about what she was doing there, whether she could afford anything. Her mother's return and immediate recognition by the store manager had transformed the guard's suspicion to fawning apologies. That night, her father had sat her down for a conversation she would never forget. "The world will try to define you before you can define yourself," he had told her, his voice gentle but his eyes fierce with protective love. "Never let them. You are Jasmine Reynolds, brilliant, talented, worthy of respect. Not because you're my daughter, but because you're a human being deserving of dignity." She'd asked why it had happened, why the guard had singled her out when she'd done nothing wrong. Because people see what they expect to see, her father had explained. They operate from assumptions they don't even recognize. Our job isn't to internalize their limitations, but to move through the world with such certainty of our own worth that eventually they're forced to question those assumptions. At the time, the advice had seemed abstract, part of the general wisdom he imparted about navigating life as a young black woman in spaces that weren't always welcoming. Now those words carried the weight of immediate reality. As they approached the Skyline Airways service desk, Jasmine spotted her flight through the massive terminal windows. It was still parked at the gate, its engines idle. A small irrational part of her hoped that someone, the captain perhaps, or even Miguel, had come to their senses and was calling for her return. But even as she watched, the jet bridge began to retract from the aircraft. Her hopes retracted with it. "This way, please," said the first officer, guiding her toward a row of uncomfortable-looking chairs near the service desk. "Wait here. Someone from Skyline will be with you shortly." Jasmine sat her backpack at her feet, her sketchbook still clutched in her hands. The officers positioned themselves nearby, not hovering directly over her, but close enough to make it clear she was under supervision. Around her, the airport continued its rhythmic chaos. Announcements echoed overhead. Travelers rushed past, dragging luggage. Children whined for snacks. Couples reunited with embraces. The ordinary ballet of air travel unfolded in stark contrast to her extraordinary situation. Jasmine opened her sketchbook, needing something to anchor her. The half-finished drawing of the aircraft wing stared back at her, a reminder of the anticipation she'd felt just 30 minutes ago. With a steady hand that belied her inner turmoil, she continued the sketch, adding detail to the curved metal shading the sky beyond. The act of drawing had always centered her, allowed her to process emotions too complex for words. When her mother died, she had filled sketchbooks with intricate designs, not of her mother's face or their memories together, but of bridges, towers, archways, structures that endured, that connected, that reached skyward, despite the weight they carried. Now her pencil moved across the paper with the same therapeutic precision. She wasn't just finishing a drawing, she was reclaiming a small measure of control. Through the terminal windows, Jasmine watched as her flight finally began to taxi away from the gate. Flight 372 was leaving without her carrying her seat, her opportunity, her planned future toward Los Angeles, while she remained behind, stranded by prejudice and procedure. The weight of it hit her fully. Then the internship she might miss, the professional connections unformed, the architectural marvels she wouldn't help create. All because one woman felt unsafe in her presence, and a crew of airline employees had accepted that assessment without question. Her phone buzzed with a text notification. It was from her father, about to head into a board meeting. "Hope you're having a smooth flight. Proud of you, Jazz." The simple message, sent with no knowledge of her situation, brought a lump to her throat. Her father, who had built an airline on principles of respect and exceptional service, would be devastated to learn how his own company had treated his daughter. But more than that, he would be furious at the injustice of it. Jasmine looked up to see a woman in a Skyline Airways uniform approaching. Her name tag identified her as Cynthia Wilkins, Customer Service Supervisor. Her expression was professionally neutral, her clipboard held like a shield against confrontation. "Miss Reynolds, I understand there was an incident aboard Flight 372. An incident. Such a clean antiseptic word for what had just happened." "No," Jasmine replied, closing her sketchbook with deliberate calm. "There was a false accusation that no one bothered to investigate before removing me from the aircraft." Cynthia's expression didn't change. "According to the report filed by our flight crew, you were exhibiting behaviors that made other passengers feel unsafe. The only behavior I exhibited was existing in seat 14A, while being Black Jasmine said her voice quiet but firm. The woman next to me decided I was a threat without any evidence, and your crew chose to believe her without question. The truth of her words hung in the air between them, raw and undeniable. The jet bridge had felt like purgatory, a liminal space between belonging and exclusion, suspended in the strange geography between aircraft and terminal. Now, sitting in the airport's bright fluorescent lighting, Jasmine felt exposed, reduced to a spectacle for curious onlookers. One of the Port Authority officers, Officer Bennett, according to his name badge, remained nearby, his posture relaxed but vigilant. The other had departed, presumably to attend to more pressing security concerns than an 18-year-old with a sketchbook. Cynthia Wilkins consulted her clipboard, avoiding Jasmine's direct gaze. "I have the report here from the lead flight attendant. It says you became confrontational when asked about recording other passengers." "My phone fell," Jasmine explained, fighting to keep her voice level. "When I reached to pick it up, the passenger accused me of filming her. I showed them my locked screen." Cynthia made a non-committal notation on her clipboard. The report also mentions aggressive body language and refusal to comply with crew instructions. The absurdity of it struck Jasmine with fresh force. The narrative being constructed bore so little resemblance to reality that it might as well have described a different person entirely. "I complied with every instruction, even though they were unjust," Jasmine replied. "I showed my boarding pass when asked. I agreed to deplane when ordered. I'm sitting here right now answering your questions." "What exactly did I refuse to comply with?" Cynthia shifted uncomfortably. "Miss Reynolds, I wasn't on the aircraft. I'm just following up based on the information provided by our crew. Has anyone asked the other passengers what they saw Jasmine pressed? There was a college student in 14C who witnessed everything. There were people in surrounding rows who could confirm I was just sitting there drawing. The captain makes the final decision regarding any security concerns," Cynthia stated, falling back on policy rather than addressing the substance of Jasmine's question. And in this case, Captain Wilson determined that removing you from the flight was the appropriate action. Through the terminal windows, Jasmine could see Flight 372 joining the queue for takeoff, its lights blinking as it taxied toward the runway. Her seat 14A was likely still empty, her absence a silent testimony to prejudice masquerading as procedure. "What happens now?" Jasmine asked suddenly, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. "You'll need to make alternative travel arrangements," Cynthia informed her with practiced detachment. "Your checked baggage will be removed from the flight and made available for pickup at baggage claim in approximately 1 hour. And my ticket," Cynthia hesitated, then delivered the final blow. "Because you were removed for cause, the ticket is non-refundable according to our terms of service. You'll need to purchase a new ticket for any future travel." The injustice of it was breathtaking. Not only had they humiliated her, stripped her of dignity, and potentially derailed her internship, but they were now charging her for the privilege. "For cause," Jasmine repeated the words bitter on her tongue. "And what cause would that be exactly?" Sitting quietly in my assigned seat. "Existing while black in first class." Officer Bennett shifted his weight, and Jasmine caught a flicker of something in his expression. Discomfort, perhaps, or even a hint of recognition that something wasn't right about this situation. Cynthia's professional veneer cracked slightly. "I understand you're upset." "No." Jasmine cut her off, her voice calm but carrying an edge of steel that would have made her father proud. "I don't think you do understand. I don't think you can possibly understand what it feels like to be singled out, falsely accused, publicly humiliated, and then told it's your fault. All because someone decided based on nothing but prejudice that you don't belong." The words hung in the air between them, raw and unanswerable. Cynthia closed her clipboard. "You can file a formal complaint through our customer relations department if you feel you've been treated unfairly. Here's an information pamphlet with the contact details." She placed a glossy trifold brochure on the seat beside Jasmine, a corporatized Band-Aid offered for a gaping wound of injustice. "Will there be anything else?" Cynthia asked, already half-turned to leave. Jasmine looked up at her, really looked at her, and saw not malice, but something perhaps more insidious indifference. Cynthia Wilkins wasn't a villain in this story. She was simply another cog in a machine designed to process incidents rather than see people. "No," Jasmine said quietly. "There's nothing else you can do for me." As Cynthia walked away, Jasmine returned her gaze to the terminal windows. Flight 372 had reached the runway now. In moments, it would accelerate down the tarmac lift into the air and carry its passengers, including Elizabeth Parker, toward Los Angeles. Without her. Officer Bennett cleared his throat. "Miss, you're free to go. We don't need to stay with you anymore." Jasmine nodded, acknowledging the small mercy of no longer being under direct supervision. As the officer walked away, she found herself truly alone for the first time since this nightmare began. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was fading, leaving behind a hollow feeling in her chest. She stared out at the runway where Flight 372 was now nothing more than distant lights ascending into the sky, carrying with it her plans, her excitement, and a piece of her belief in fairness. But as she watched the aircraft vanish into the clouds, something else was taking shape inside her, a resolve hardened by injustice, a determination forged in humiliation. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Jasmine Reynolds. The voice belonged to yet another Skyline Airways employee. This one an older woman with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her name tag identified her as Diane Palmer, Senior Customer Relations Manager. Jasmine looked up from her sketchbook where she'd been drawing with focused intensity for the past 20 minutes. "Yes, I've been asked to follow up on your situation." Diane's hesitation suggested she'd been briefed but was uncertain about the details. "Cynthia mentioned you had concerns about how your case was handled." "My case?" Jasmine repeated the corporate terminology grating on her. Is that what you call it when a paying customer is falsely accused and publicly humiliated? Diane's expression remained carefully neutral, her eyes flicking to Jasmine's simple clothing, then to her sketchbook making silent assessments. I understand you're upset. That's completely natural. Flying can be stressful for everyone. The patronizing tone made Jasmine's jaw tighten. It was as if Diane were speaking to a child having a tantrum rather than an adult who had experienced discrimination. I'm not stressed about flying, Jasmine clarified, her voice measured. I'm upset about being removed from a flight based on false accusations that no one bothered to investigate. Diane sat down beside her, maintaining a careful professional distance. Let me explain how these situations work. When a passenger or crew member reports a security concern, we have protocols that must be followed. The captain has final authority. I know about the protocols, Jasmine interrupted. My concern isn't that protocols exist. It's that they were applied based on prejudice rather than facts. This seemed to catch Diane off guard. Prejudice is a very serious accusation. So is calling someone a security threat? Jasmine countered. Diane glanced down at the file in her hands. According to our lead flight attendant's report, you were exhibiting concerning behavior that made another passenger feel unsafe. We take these reports very seriously. What behavior specifically? Jasmine pressed. Diane scanned the report. It says here you were, let me see, agitated, confrontational when questioned, and potentially filming other passengers without consent. Jasmine felt a surge of indignation. I was drawing in my sketchbook with headphones on. My phone fell, and when I reached to pick it up, I was accused of filming. The phone was locked. Anyone could have verified that in seconds. These situations can be complex. No, Jasmine said firmly. This situation was actually very simple. A woman decided I didn't belong in seat 14A, made false accusations, and your staff chose to believe her without question. Diane's professional demeanor remained intact, but something in her eyes shifted, perhaps recognition of the truth in Jasmine's words, or perhaps simple discomfort at being challenged. Well, she said after a moment, what would you like to see happen now? It was a standard customer service question meant to channel dissatisfaction toward a manageable resolution. Free miles, perhaps, or a voucher for future travel. I want accountability, Jasmine replied. I want the crew members who failed to investigate false accusations to be retrained. I want the woman who made those accusations to face consequences for disrupting a flight with lies. And I want a full refund for my ticket and compensation for the internship opportunity I may now miss. Diane's expression made it clear these demands exceeded what she was authorized to offer. I can process a complaint form that will be reviewed by our customer advocacy team. They typically respond within 10 business days. 10 business days. By then, her internship would be well underway, or not, depending on whether she could make alternative arrangements in time. And in the meantime, Jasmine asked, my flight just left without me based on false accusations. I have an important internship starting tomorrow in Los Angeles. You're welcome to purchase a ticket on another flight, though I should warn you that same-day bookings tend to be at premium rates. Diane's tone suggested this was a generous concession. As for your original ticket, as Cynthia explained, our policy states that passengers removed for security concerns forfeit the value of their fare. The injustice of it was staggering. Not only had they humiliated her and potentially derailed a career opportunity, but they expected her to pay for the privilege. Jasmine took a deep breath, centering herself. I'd like your full name and employee ID number, please. And the names of the flight crew members involved in this incident. Diane stiffened slightly. I'm afraid I can't provide staff information. That would be a privacy violation, but my name is Diane Palmer, and you're welcome to include that in any formal complaint. I will, Jasmine assured her. And I'll also need the name of your direct supervisor and the contact information for Skyline's legal department. Something in Jasmine's tone, the calm certainty perhaps, or the precision of her requests, seemed to give Diane pause. She studied Jasmine more carefully now, as if seeing her for the first time. "Are you an attorney, Ms. Reynolds?" "No," Jasmine replied. "I'm an architectural student, but my father always taught me to document everything when dealing with institutional failures." Diane hesitated, then stood. "I'll get you that complaint form, and I'll see if there are any seats available on later flights to Los Angeles, though, as I mentioned, they would be at your expense." As Diane walked away, Jasmine returned her gaze to the terminal windows. Flight 372 was no longer visible, having disappeared into the vast sky beyond JFK. Through the glass, she could see her own reflection, composed, dignified, resolute, despite everything that had happened. Beyond her reflection, she saw the other aircraft at their gates, the ground crews in their safety vests, the endless choreography of air travel continuing without interruption. One of those planes bore the Skyline Airways livery, the distinctive blue and silver design her father had personally approved when rebranding the airline 5 years ago. The sight of it brought a fresh wave of emotion. This was her father's company, built on his vision of exceptional service and respect for every passenger. How far it had fallen in the hands of people who saw protocols rather than people. Jasmine checked the time. The board meeting in Dallas would be underway now. Her father would be at the head of the table reviewing quarterly projections, unaware that his only daughter had just experienced the worst kind of treatment aboard his own airline. She opened her phone and navigated to her contacts. Her thumb hovered over her father's name. She had always been fiercely independent, determined to make her own way without trading on her family name. Even when applying for the Hartwell and Morrison internship, she had used her portfolio alone, refusing to mention her connection to one of the country's most successful black entrepreneurs. But this wasn't about advantage anymore. This was about justice. With a deep breath, she pressed the call button. Jasmine. "Is everything okay, honey?" Her father's voice, deep and concerned, came through immediately despite the background noise of what sounded like a conference room. "Dad," she began, her composed facade finally cracking. "I'm still at JFK. There's been a problem." "A problem? What kind of problem? Are you hurt?" The immediate shift to protective mode was so familiar, so comforting, that Jasmine felt tears threatening. "I'm not hurt," she assured him quickly. "But Dad? They kicked me off the flight. They kicked me off your flight." There was a moment of silence, then the background noise diminished as if her father had moved to a quieter location. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said, his voice now controlled but with an undercurrent of steel that anyone who had negotiated with Dominic Reynolds would immediately recognize. "Start from the beginning." Jasmine took a deep breath and recounted the events in precise detail. Elizabeth Parker's immediate hostility, the false accusations, Heather and Rachel's failure to investigate Thomas Brooks' dismissive attitude, the humiliation of being escorted off by Port Authority, and finally the administrative dismissal from Diane Palmer. Her father listened without interruption, though she could almost feel his growing tension through the phone. When she finally finished, there was a momentary silence. "Stay exactly where you are," he said, his voice now barely above a whisper but carrying an authority that could command armies. "Don't speak to any more Skyline staff. Don't sign anything. Don't accept any offers or vouchers." "Dad, my internship starts tomorrow," Jasmine reminded him, the reality of her situation crashing back. "I can't just—" "You'll be there," he assured her with absolute certainty. "I'm handling this. Right now I need you to go to the Skyline Executive Lounge. Do you remember where it is, Terminal 4 near Gate B20? She replied, recalling their many family trips. "Good. Tell them your name at the desk. They'll be expecting you. A car will be sent to take you home for now. We'll get you to Los Angeles today, I promise." The certainty in his voice was like a lifeline. Throughout her childhood, when Dominic Reynolds said something would happen, it invariably did. Whether it was securing front-row tickets to a sold-out show or arranging a private tour of the Louvre after hours, he had a way of making the impossible seem routine. "Dad, I didn't want to call you about this," she admitted. "I wanted to handle it myself, but Jasmine," he interrupted gently. "There's advocating for yourself, and then there's recognizing when a system is deliberately stacked against you. What happened wasn't about you. It was about a failure in my airline, in my company. That makes it my responsibility." She could hear the controlled fury beneath his measured words. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Right now, I'm going to make sure you're taken care of. Then I'm going to remind some people of exactly who they work for and what Skyline Airways stands for." There was a pause. "Then I love you, Jazz. I'm so sorry this happened to you. I love you too, Dad." As she ended the call, Jasmine felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that her father would help discomfort at having to rely on his intervention, but primarily a burning sense that justice was now inevitable. Diane Palmer was returning a clipboard in hand and a forced smile on her face. "Ms. Reynolds, I have that complaint form for you, and I've checked our later flights. There's a seat available on our 2:15 p.m. departure to Los Angeles, though the fare is $1,249. Jasmine stood, gathering her backpack and sketchbook with deliberate calm. "That won't be necessary, Ms. Palmer. I've made other arrangements." Diane looked confused. "But your complaint will be addressed," Jasmine assured her, though not through a form. "Thank you for your time." As she walked away, Jasmine caught a glimpse of Diane's perplexed expression. The customer service manager clearly wasn't accustomed to people walking away from her carefully scripted resolutions. Jasmine made her way through the terminal toward the Skyline Executive Lounge. As she approached the entrance with its frosted glass doors bearing the silver-blue Skyline logo, she felt a strange sense of homecoming. How many times had she sat in this lounge with her father, watching him greet staff by name, ask about their families, treat everyone from the janitor to the executive lounge manager with the same respect. The young woman at the reception desk looked up as Jasmine approached. "Welcome to the Skyline Executive Lounge. May I see your boarding pass and membership card?" "My name is Jasmine Reynolds," she said simply. The receptionist's fingers froze over her keyboard, her eyes widening slightly. "Ms. Reynolds. Yes, of course. We just received notification to expect you." She stood quickly. "Please come in. We have a private room prepared for you." As Jasmine followed her through the lounge, she noticed heads turning, whispers exchanged. News traveled fast in an airline, and it seemed the word was already spreading. The private room was small but elegant, with comfortable seating and a window overlooking the tarmac. On the table sat a bottle of her favorite sparkling water and a plate of fresh fruit, small touches that reminded her of her father's attention to detail. "Is there anything else you need, Ms. Reynolds?" The receptionist asked, her previously confident demeanor now tinged with nervous energy. "No, thank you," Jasmine replied. Then, seeing the young woman's anxiety, she added, "This situation isn't your fault. You have nothing to worry about." The receptionist's relief was palpable. "Thank you, Ms. Reynolds. Someone will be here shortly to assist with your travel arrangements." As the door closed, leaving her alone in the quiet room, Jasmine looked out at the runway where Flight 372 had departed less than an hour ago. Somewhere over the eastern seaboard, Elizabeth Parker was probably sipping champagne smug in her victory, unaware that her actions had set in motion events that would soon come crashing back upon her. Jasmine opened her sketchbook to a fresh page and began to draw. Not the aircraft wing this time, but the outline of a new structure, strong, balanced, resilient against forces that would try to topple it. Just like her. In a glass-walled conference room 50 floors above downtown Dallas, Dominic Reynolds stood at the window, his back to the assembled executives of Skyline Airways. At 52, he cut an imposing figure, 6'2", with broad shoulders and the physique of a man who still found time for the gym, despite running a multi-billion-dollar corporation. His tailored charcoal suit bore no flashy labels, just impeccable craftsmanship and the subtle blue pocket square that matched Skyline's corporate color. The silence in the room was deafening. None of the 12 people seated around the mahogany table dared to speak. They had just witnessed their CEO abruptly end a quarterly earnings call, something unheard of in corporate America, and dismiss 2 senior VPs from the room with nothing more than a glance. When Dominic finally turned around, his expression was composed, but anyone who knew him recognized the dangerous stillness in his eyes. This was not the charismatic leader featured in business magazines or the approachable boss who remembered everyone's names and family details. This was the Dominic Reynolds, who had built an empire from a single leased aircraft and outlasted competitors through sheer force of will. Janet, he addressed his chief operating officer, Janet Rivera, directly. Get Alfonso Garcia at JFK Operations on a secure line, now. Janet nodded, already dialing on her phone. Dominic turned to his chief legal counsel, Andrew Patterson. Andrew, I want a full investigation into an incident on Flight 372 initiated immediately. Everything: crew statements, passenger accounts, security footage, everything. Andrew was already taking notes. What exactly are we looking for? A catastrophic failure of our most basic principles, Dominic replied, his voice controlled but vibrating with intensity. A passenger was just removed from that flight based on false accusations that no one bothered to verify. I want to know how this happened and who allowed it. The executives exchanged nervous glances. Customer complaints were common in the airline industry, usually handled through established channels, not by the CEO himself. Sir, ventured the VP of Customer Experience, perhaps we should route this through our normal escalation procedures. This is not going through procedures. Dominic cut him off. This is going through me. Janet looked up from her phone. I have Alfonso Garcia on the line. Dominic took the phone. Alfonso. Dominic Reynolds. Through the speakerphone came a startled voice. Mr. Reynolds. Sir, I wasn't expecting. How can I help you? What's happening with Flight 372? Dominic asked, his tone making it clear this was not a casual inquiry. Flight 372 Alfonso's confusion was evident. It's just cleared for takeoff, sir. There was a brief delay due to a passenger removal, but the flight is now third in line for departure. Who was the passenger? A moment of hesitation. A Jasmine Reynolds, sir. Seat 14A. The temperature in the conference room seemed to drop by several degrees. The executives, now realizing what was happening, sat perfectly still. Alfonso Dominic said, his voice dangerously quiet, that plane does not take off. Have air traffic control hold it at the threshold. Tell them it's a critical security reassessment initiated by the airline. I don't care what procedures you have to invoke or what it costs. That aircraft does not move another inch. Sir, the delay, the cost. Alfonso started to protest. The cost, Dominic interrupted, of what happened in that cabin is already greater than you can calculate. Get that plane held at the threshold. Then arrange ground equipment to tow it back to gate B42. Yes, sir. And Alfonso, I'm on my way. My plane takes off in 20 minutes. He ended the call and handed the phone back to Janet. His gaze swept the room, taking in the shocked faces of his executive team. For those of you who haven't put it together yet, Jasmine Reynolds is my daughter. But that is not why I'm intervening. I'm intervening because what happened on that flight represents a fundamental betrayal of everything Skyline Airways stands for. He turned to his VP of Operations. Michael, get the corporate jet ready. File a flight plan for JFK. Michael nodded and left the room immediately. Dominic addressed the remaining executives. This meeting is suspended. Janet and Andrew will come with me to New York. The rest of you will receive detailed instructions once I've assessed the situation fully. As the executives filed out, Dominic checked his phone. There was a new message, not from Jasmine, but from a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Reynolds, my name is Olivia Bennett. I was a passenger in seat 2B on flight 372. I witnessed the entire incident involving your daughter and have it on video. What I saw was a disgrace. I got your number through a mutual connection at Goldman Sachs. I believe you'll want to see this before your cruise version becomes the official record." Attached was a video file. Dominic played it immediately, his expression hardening as he watched the events unfold exactly as Jasmine had described her quiet drawing interrupted by Elizabeth Parker's theatrical complaints, the flight attendant's immediate bias, the baseless accusation of filming the humiliating removal. The video captured everything, including the surrounding passengers' reactions. Most notably, it showed Miguel Ramirez in 14C clearly witnessing everything but refusing to speak up. Andrew Dominic said, forwarding the video to his legal counsel. "Evidence. Unedited and damning." Andrew reviewed it quickly, his professional demeanor faltering as he watched. This is indefensible." "Yes," Dominic agreed grimly. "It is." He typed a quick reply to Olivia Bennett. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention. Your integrity is appreciated. Would you be willing to provide a formal statement?" Her response came immediately. "Absolutely. What happened was wrong on every level. I've already saved backup copies of the video on secure cloud storage." Dominic pocketed his phone and turned to Janet and Andrew. "Let's go. We have a plane to catch and some hard questions to ask when we land." As they exited the conference room, Dominic's assistant handed him a tablet with the personnel files of the Flight 372 crew already pulled up. Captain James Wilson, lead flight attendant, Rachel Collins, flight attendant Heather Davidson, and gate agent Thomas Brooks. In the elevator descending to the garage level, Janet spoke quietly. "Dominic, what exactly are you planning to do?" Dominic's gaze remained fixed on the elevator doors. "I'm going to remind everyone on that aircraft who they work for and what this airline stands for. And then I'm going to make an example that ensures this never happens again." The elevator doors opened to reveal a waiting car. As they rode to the private airfield where the corporate jet was being prepared, Dominic reviewed the video again, his jaw tightening with each viewing. By the time they boarded the sleek Gulfstream G650, the full machinery of Skyline Airways' executive powers had been mobilized. Teams were being dispatched to JFK, statements were being prepared, and a crisis management protocol that had never been used in the company's history was being activated. As the corporate jet accelerated down the runway, lifting into the clear Texas sky, Dominic Reynolds sat quietly looking out the window at his company's headquarters receding below. He had built Skyline Airways from nothing, transforming it from a regional carrier into a national powerhouse through a simple philosophy: treat every passenger with dignity and respect. Today, that philosophy had been betrayed on his watch against his own daughter. The reckoning that was coming would reshape Skyline Airways forever. And somewhere on a taxiway at JFK Flight 372 was being ordered to hold position, its puzzled passengers about to learn that sometimes justice arrives with unexpected swiftness. Olivia Bennett had not planned to get involved. As a corporate attorney specializing in employment law, she had learned early in her career to observe carefully, document thoroughly, but intervene selectively. From her seat in 2B, she had a perfect view of row 14 where the incident had unfolded like a textbook case of bias in action. She had watched as the young black woman Jasmine she now knew was systematically isolated, accused, and ultimately removed, all without a shred of evidence or due process. She had witnessed Elizabeth Parker's performance, the flight attendant's immediate acceptance of her claims, and the young man's cowardly silence, and she had recorded everything. The decision to record hadn't been premeditated. When Elizabeth first signaled for the flight attendant, Olivia had merely looked up from her legal brief, mildly curious about the interaction. But something in Elizabeth's theatrical whisper, the immediate shift in Heather's demeanor upon looking at Jasmine, had triggered her professional instincts. 20 years of employment litigation had taught Olivia to recognize the patterns of workplace discrimination. This wasn't a courtroom, but the dynamics were identical. An accusation based on assumptions rather than evidence, immediate credibility extended to one party, but not the other, escalation without investigation, and finally punishment without due process. So she had unobtrusively activated her phone's camera and placed it on her tray table, angled to capture the scene while she pretended to continue reading her brief. Now, as Flight 372 sat motionless on the taxiway, its engines idling as the passengers grew increasingly restless, Olivia reviewed the video on her phone. The footage was damning clear, unambiguous evidence of bias in action. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Wilson speaking," came the announcement over the PA system. "We've been asked to hold position temporarily while we address a security matter. We appreciate your patience and will update you as soon as we have more information." A collective groan rose from the cabin. The woman across the aisle from Olivia checked her watch and muttered, "This is ridiculous. I have a connection to catch." Olivia said nothing, continuing to review her footage. As an employment attorney, she had seen countless cases of discrimination, had represented both plaintiffs and defendants, had witnessed the corporate machinery that often prioritized liability management over justice. But rarely had she seen such a clear example of bias translating directly into harmful action. What made it particularly striking was how routine it had seemed to the flight crew, the casual way they had accepted Elizabeth's accusation, the automatic assumption that Jasmine must be the problem, the complete lack of critical evaluation. It wasn't malice. It was something perhaps more insidious, a habitual, unexamined bias that operated below the level of conscious decision-making. Heather Davidson appeared in the aisle, moving through the cabin with a strained smile. "Can I get you anything while we wait, ma'am?" she asked Olivia. "No, thank you," Olivia replied, studying the flight attendant with professional interest. "But I do have a question. Of course, the young woman who was removed, what exactly did she do wrong?" The question clearly caught Heather off guard. Her customer service smile faltered slightly. "I'm afraid I can't discuss other passengers, ma'am." "That's interesting," Olivia replied, her tone conversational, but with a lawyer's precision, because you and your colleagues had no problem discussing her while removing her from the aircraft. Heather's expression tightened. "As I said, I can't discuss the situation. It was a security matter." "A security matter." Olivia repeated, her tone making it clear what she thought of that characterization. "I see. Thank you." As Heather moved away, visibly relieved to escape the uncomfortable conversation, Olivia returned her attention to her phone. Her firm represented several major corporations, including Goldman Sachs, where she had once worked alongside Dominic Reynolds on a complex acquisition. They weren't friends exactly, but they had mutual respect and had stayed loosely connected over the years. It had taken one call to her former colleague at Goldman to get Dominic's direct number. Now, having sent him the video and received his swift response, she felt a professional satisfaction in knowing that justice would likely be served. But there was something more, a personal stake in seeing this right, perhaps because she had remained silent during the actual incident, watching rather than intervening. At 37, Olivia had built her career on carefully choosing her battles on strategic rather than reactive engagement. But as she watched the video again, she wondered if strategy sometimes became an excuse for inaction. "Excuse me," said the man in the window seat beside her, interrupting her thoughts. "Do you know what's going on? This doesn't feel like a normal delay." "No," Olivia replied thoughtfully. "I don't think it is." The aircraft's engines suddenly powered down completely. Not the usual temporary reduction during a short hold, but a full shutdown that suggested they wouldn't be moving anytime soon. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Wilson's voice came over the PA system again, an edge of tension now evident. "I've just received information that we'll be returning to the gate. We apologize for the inconvenience and will provide more details once we're back at the terminal." The cabin erupted in confusion and complaints. Returning to the gate. "We were about to take off," exclaimed a businessman across the aisle. "This is outrageous." From row 14, Olivia could see Elizabeth Parker's reaction, initially annoyed like the other passengers, but then a flicker of something else crossed her face. Uncertainty, concern, perhaps even the first stirrings of fear. As if sensing Olivia's gaze, Elizabeth turned slightly, their eyes meeting briefly across the cabin. Olivia didn't look away. She simply held the other woman's gaze long enough to communicate that she had seen everything, not just the incident with Jasmine, but the truth beneath Elizabeth's performance of victimhood. Elizabeth turned away, first her posture suddenly less confident. The aircraft began to move again, but in reverse, being pushed back toward the gate by a tug rather than moving under its own power. This unusual procedure confirmed what Olivia already suspected: this was no routine return. Her phone vibrated with a message from Dominic Reynolds, ETA JFK 11:45 a.m. Would appreciate if you could remain on the aircraft when it returns to gate. Corporate security will escort other passengers off. Thank you again for your integrity. Olivia sent a brief confirmation, and then settled back in her seat, watching with professional interest as the cabin crew's previously confident demeanor began to show cracks of concern. Rachel, the lead flight attendant who had been instrumental in removing Jasmine, was now in hushed conversation with Heather near the forward galley, their expressions growing increasingly anxious as they spoke. In row 14, Miguel Ramirez had abandoned any pretense of reading his engineering textbook. He sat rigidly, his gaze fixed on nothing, his expression that of someone replaying a moment of moral failure and finding no comfort in the review. Olivia had seen this dynamic play out countless times in workplace investigations, the moment when those who had enabled injustice through action or inaction began to realize that accountability might be coming. As the aircraft completed its return journey to Gate B42, Olivia caught sight of something unusual through her window. Several black SUVs with the Skyline Airways logo parked near the jet bridge, and a group of individuals in corporate attire waiting with an air of grim determination. The justice she had helped set in motion was about to arrive, and she felt no ambivalence about her role in what would follow. Sometimes the most ethical choice wasn't neutrality or strategic restraint, but simple truth-telling, ensuring that what had happened in row 14 would not be buried under corporate procedure or selective memory. Olivia Bennett had not planned to get involved, but watching injustice unfold and doing nothing would have made her complicit in a way her professional conscience could not accept. As the aircraft door opened and corporate security personnel boarded, rather than the usual ground crew, she felt a quiet satisfaction. The law wasn't just what happened in courtrooms. It was about fundamental fairness, about systems that either upheld or betrayed basic human dignity. Today, on Flight 372, the scales of justice were about to be rebalanced. "This is ridiculous," Elizabeth Parker's voice carried through the cabin as Flight 372 taxied back to Gate B42. "I have a critical meeting this afternoon. They can't just turn us around without explanation." Around her, passengers muttered similar complaints, their frustration building with each passing minute. The aircraft had been airborne for less than 10 minutes before being ordered to return to the airport, and the lack of clear information had created a cocktail of confusion and irritation. Miguel Ramirez sat silently beside Elizabeth, his discomfort growing. Something about this situation felt connected to the young woman who had been removed, Jasmine. He had heard the flight attendant call her. His conscience nagged at him for his silence when he could have spoken up. He had watched the entire interaction unfold, had seen Jasmine quietly drawing in her sketchbook, had witnessed Elizabeth's immediate hostility and theatrical complaints. He had known the accusations were false, had seen the surprise and dignity in Jasmine's response, and when directly asked if he had seen anything threatening, he had chosen self-preservation over truth. "I don't want to get involved." The words echoed in his mind, now 5 simple syllables that encapsulated a profound moral failure. As a first-generation college student on scholarship, Miguel had been taught to keep his head down to avoid conflicts that might derail his hard-won opportunities. But that caution had transformed into cowardice in a moment when someone needed his voice. From her seat in first class, Olivia Bennett observed the increasing tension with professional detachment. She noted how Rachel and Heather moved through the cabin with strained smiles, offering vague reassurances while clearly harboring their own anxieties. The typical confidence of Skyline Airways cabin crew had evaporated, replaced by an unmistakable nervous energy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Wilson's voice came over the PA system, noticeably less assured than during his previous announcements. "We're approaching Gate B42. We ask that you remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we've come to a complete stop and the seatbelt sign has been turned off. We apologize for the inconvenience and thank you for your patience." The hesitation in his voice was subtle but unmistakable, a hairline crack in the professional facade that airline captains typically maintained regardless of circumstances. As the aircraft completed its taxi and the jet bridge began to extend toward the door, Olivia noticed unusual activity on the tarmac. Several black SUVs with the Skyline Airways logo were parked nearby, and a group of individuals in corporate attire stood waiting with an air of grim determination. "What's happening?" asked her seatmate, noticing the same scene. "That doesn't look like a mechanical issue to me." "It's not," Olivia replied simply. The aircraft door opened, but instead of the usual ground crew, a man in a Skyline Airways executive uniform stepped aboard. His badge identified him as Alfonso Garcia, JFK Operations Director. He conferred briefly with the lead flight attendant, whose face visibly paled at whatever information he shared. Rachel then moved to the center of the first-class cabin, her professional demeanor barely masking her distress. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the inconvenience. All passengers will be deplaning temporarily while we address an administrative matter. You'll be escorted to our premium lounge where refreshments will be provided. We anticipate a delay of approximately 2 hours." A chorus of groans and objections rose from the cabin. "This is outrageous," Elizabeth Parker's voice cut through the general discontent. "I demand an explanation. I'm a Diamond Elite member, and I have rights." Olivia couldn't help but note the irony. Elizabeth, who had been so quick to dismiss Jasmine's rights, was now indignantly claiming her own. The deplaning process began with first-class passengers. As Olivia approached the door, Alfonso spoke quietly to her. "Ms. Bennett, we've been asked to escort you to a private area once the other passengers have deplaned. Mr. Reynolds would like to speak with you." She nodded, stepping aside to allow other passengers to exit. As the regular passengers filed out, directed toward the premium lounge with vouchers and apologies, Olivia noticed something unusual. Certain individuals were being subtly identified by security personnel and guided to a separate area. Elizabeth Parker was one of them. Miguel Ramirez was another. When Elizabeth reached the door, she was met by 2 Skyline corporate security officers. "Ms. Parker," one of them said, "would you please come with us? There's a matter that requires your attention." Elizabeth's confident demeanor faltered slightly. "What matter? I have a connection to make." "It concerns an incident earlier today," the officer replied, his tone professional but unyielding. "Please come with us." As Elizabeth was led away, looking confused and increasingly concerned, Miguel Ramirez attempted to blend in with the crowd of deplaning passengers. But as he reached the door, he too was addressed by name. "Mr. Ramirez, we'd appreciate a few moments of your time as well." His face flushed with guilt and anxiety. "Am I in trouble?" The security officer's expression revealed nothing. "We just need your statement regarding the incident in row 14. One by one, key witnesses were identified and separated from the general passenger population, Elizabeth Parker, Miguel Ramirez, and several passengers who had been seated near row 14. The flight crew remained aboard their usual end-of-flight routines, suspended as they waited with poorly concealed apprehension. Captain Wilson had emerged from the cockpit, his captain's hat held tightly in hands, that betrayed the slightest tremor. "What exactly is happening?" he demanded of Rachel, who stood near the galley, her composure cracking. "I don't know," she admitted. But they mentioned Dominic Reynolds. The name fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of dread through the assembled crew. Skyline's founder and CEO was known for his hands-on approach and uncompromising standards, but direct intervention from the top was unprecedented. Outside, through the cockpit windows, they could see a sleek Gulfstream G650 with the Skyline executive livery taxiing to a private area of the terminal. Dominic Reynolds had arrived, and as the last regular passengers deplaned directed toward the premium lounge with vouchers and apologies, the aircraft that had been the site of Jasmine's humiliation now became the stage for its reckoning. The cabin, normally bustling with activity during turnaround, fell into an eerie silence. The flight crew, Captain Wilson, First Officer Davis, Rachel Collins, Heather Davidson, and 2 other flight attendants gathered in the forward cabin, their usual professional confidence replaced by growing unease. Thomas Brooks, the gate agent who had escorted Jasmine off the plane, was summoned aboard, his face already pale with apprehension. None of them spoke. They simply waited the minutes, stretching painfully for the arrival of the man whose name was emblazoned on the side of every aircraft in the Skyline fleet. "Tower is asking for an update on our status." First Officer Laura Mendez reported, her hand covering the microphone of her headset. "They want to know if we're declaring an emergency or if this is a mechanical issue." Captain James Wilson stared at the radio, his 27 years of aviation experience offering no precedent for the current situation. When the order had come to return to JFK, he had initially assumed it was a standard security protocol, perhaps a passenger on the no-fly list who had been identified after takeoff, or an overlooked maintenance issue requiring immediate attention. But the specific instruction to return to gate B42, the same gate they had departed from, coupled with the phrase, "direct order from Dallas," had triggered an alarm in his mind that grew louder with each passing minute. "Tell them." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Tell them we're returning due to an administrative security review. Not an emergency, not mechanical." Laura relayed the message, then turned to him with concern etching her features. "James, what's really happening? This doesn't make sense." Captain Wilson removed his headset and ran a hand through his silver-gray hair. Unlike many pilots who maintained a military-style crew cut, he wore his hair slightly longer, a small rebellion against conformity that his otherwise spotless professional record had allowed him. "I think it has to do with that passenger we removed before departure, the young woman in 14A. The security risk," Laura frowned. "But that was by the book. Rachel reported a disruptive passenger. You made the call as captain. Standard procedure. Maybe Wilson conceded, but something about this feels different." The order came from Dallas Laura. From the top. The top, she repeated, the significance dawning on her. "You mean?" He nodded grimly. "Dominic Reynolds himself." The name hung between them like a storm cloud. Unlike most major airlines, where the CEO was a distant figure, known primarily through quarterly reports and occasional company-wide emails, Dominic Reynolds remained intimately involved with Skyline's operations. A former pilot himself, he maintained his licenses and occasionally flew routes to stay connected with the day-to-day reality of his airline. But why would the CEO get involved in a routine passenger removal, Laura asked, voicing the question that had been troubling Wilson since the return order came. Before he could respond, a call came through on the aircraft's internal communication system. "Captain, this is Rachel." The lead flight attendant's voice was strained. "There's a situation developing. We have senior corporate staff boarding and they're asking all passengers to deplane." "What kind of situation, Rachel?" "I'm not sure, but—" Her voice dropped to nearly a whisper. They mentioned Jasmine Reynolds. Wilson's blood ran cold. Reynolds, the passenger they had removed, the security risk. Could she be? Oh, God. He muttered, the pieces suddenly falling into place. Laura checked the manifest. What was the full name of the passenger in 14A? Laura quickly pulled up the flight manifest on the cockpit display. Jasmine Reynolds, she read, then looked up with widening eyes. You don't think... The CEO's daughter, Wilson, confirmed, his voice hollow. We just threw the owner's daughter off her own family's airplane. The realization hit with the force of physical blow. In all his years of flying, James Wilson had faced turbulence, mechanical issues, even a bird strike that had required an emergency landing. But nothing in his training had prepared him for this. The dawning horror that he had signed off on removing Jasmine Reynolds based on nothing more than the complaint of another passenger and his lead flight attendant's assessment. But we followed procedure. Laura insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. If she had identified herself, would you? Wilson interrupted. If you were being falsely accused, would you play the "do you know who I am" card, or would you expect to be treated fairly, regardless of who you were? The question wasn't just rhetorical. It struck at the heart of what had happened, the fundamental failure to see Jasmine Reynolds as a person deserving of basic dignity and fair treatment, regardless of her name or connections. Laura had no answer for that. She stared out the cockpit window where ground crew were now positioning the jet bridge. What happens now? I don't know, Wilson admitted. But whatever it is, we face it directly. No excuses, no deflections. The cabin interphone buzzed again. Captain Rachel's voice had lost all pretense of professional calm. They're asking for you to come out of the cockpit. Immediately. Wilson straightened his uniform jacket and replaced his captain's hat, a futile gesture of dignity before what he suspected would be the most difficult confrontation of his career. Maintain position, he instructed Laura. I'll handle this. As he stepped out of the cockpit, the first thing Wilson noticed was the absence of passengers. The cabin, which should have been bustling with the controlled chaos of 189 travelers, was eerily empty, except for his crew, who stood in a tight, anxious cluster near the forward galley. Thomas Brooks had joined them, the gate agent's typically confident demeanor replaced by visible apprehension. His tie was slightly askew, a small detail that somehow emphasized the gravity of the situation. What's the situation? Wilson asked, attempting to reassert his authority as the aircraft's commanding officer. Rachel glanced toward the still-open cabin door. Corporate security has removed all passengers to the lounge. They're taking statements from those seated near 14A. And... She swallowed hard. Mr. Reynolds is on his way. The CEO himself. The confirmation of his fears sent a chill through Wilson's spine. In the carefully structured hierarchy of an airline, the captain's authority was nearly absolute, second only to the Federal Aviation Administration, and in this case, the man who owned the company. All right, Wilson said, gathering himself. We followed standard security protocols based on the information available to us. If there was a misunderstanding, we'll address it professionally. Even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow. Heather, the flight attendant who had first responded to Elizabeth Parker's complaint, spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. Captain, what if we were wrong? What if she really didn't do anything? The question hung in the air, unanswerable and damning. Before Wilson could respond, a movement at the cabin door drew their attention. A man in a Skyline corporate security uniform stepped aboard. Captain Wilson, Ms. Collins, Mr. Brooks. He addressed them formally. Mr. Reynolds will be boarding momentarily. He has requested that you and your crew remain in the forward cabin. The security officer's tone made it clear this was not a request but an order. As he stepped back, the crew caught a glimpse of the activity outside, a small group of executives in formal business attire, approaching the jet bridge, led by a tall, imposing figure whose mere presence seemed to command the space around him. Dominic Reynolds had arrived, and the reckoning was about to begin. The Skyline Airways Premium Lounge had been cleared of its regular patrons, the space now occupied solely by the passengers from Flight 372. The atmosphere crackled with irritation and confusion as travelers gathered in small clusters speculating about the unusual return to JFK and the subsequent deplaning. "This is completely unacceptable," declared a man in an expensive suit, his Diamond Elite status evident from the luggage tag attached to his briefcase. "I have meetings in Los Angeles that can't be rescheduled. Skyline will be hearing from my company about this." Similar complaints echoed throughout the lounge, the passengers united in their frustration, if nothing else. Elizabeth Parker sat alone in a corner, her previous confidence eroded by the unsettling experience of being escorted separately from the other passengers. The corporate security officers had been polite but firm, informing her that her presence would be required for an investigative review before she could continue her journey. What investigation she had demanded. "I haven't done anything wrong." Their non-committal responses had only increased her anxiety. Now isolated from the other passengers and nursing a sparkling water she didn't want, Elizabeth felt the first stirrings of genuine alarm. Something was happening. Something beyond the typical disruptions of air travel, and she had a growing suspicion it was connected to that girl in 14A. Elizabeth Parker had built her career at Whitley & Associates through a combination of genuine talent and ruthless efficiency. As a senior marketing executive specializing in corporate reputation management, she had developed a particular skill for identifying and eliminating threats to her client's public image and to her own professional advancement. That skill had served her well in an industry still dominated by men, many of whom viewed her as an interloper rather than an equal. She had learned to use every advantage to establish dominance in subtle ways, to ensure her comfort and authority were never questioned. The incident with Jasmine had been almost reflexive, a habitual assertion of her presumed status over someone she perceived as not belonging in her space. She hadn't thought of it as prejudice. She had framed it to herself as maintaining proper standards, as ensuring her comfort on a long flight. But now, watching the unusually serious demeanor of the Skyline staff and the separate handling of specific passengers, a cold realization was forming in her mind. This wasn't routine. This was targeted. And somehow she had become the target. Across the lounge, Miguel Ramirez sat with his laptop open but untouched, his mind replaying the scene in row 14 again and again. He had witnessed everything. Elizabeth's immediate hostility, Jasmine's calm confusion, the flight attendant's biased intervention. And he had said nothing, had pretended not to see, had chosen his own comfort over doing what he knew was right. "Mr. Ramirez." A woman in a Skyline corporate uniform approached him. "We'd appreciate a few moments of your time if you wouldn't mind following me." Miguel nodded, gathering his belongings with shaking hands. As he followed the woman to a private conference room adjacent to the lounge, he made a decision. If asked, he would tell the truth, all of it, even the parts that reflected poorly on himself. It was a small penance for his earlier silence, but it was something. Meanwhile, aboard Flight 372, the tension had built to an almost unbearable level. Captain Wilson and his crew stood in a loose semicircle in the first-class cabin like defendants awaiting a verdict. Through the still open cabin door, they could see the approaching executives led by Dominic Reynolds. "Remember?" Wilson murmured to his crew. "We followed protocol based on the information we had at the time. Stay professional." Rachel Collins nodded mechanically, but her usual poise had abandoned her. Beside her, Heather Davidson stared at the floor, her face pale. Thomas Brooks stood slightly apart from the flight crew, as if hoping to distance himself from whatever was about to unfold. The first aboard was a woman in her early 40s, her tailored suit and confident stride marking her as an executive. Janet Rivera, Chief Operating Officer. She introduced herself briskly, though her focus was clearly on the cabin door behind her. Next came a man carrying a leather portfolio, his expression grave. Andrew Patterson, Chief Legal Counsel, he stated, taking position beside Janet. And then finally Dominic Reynolds himself stepped aboard Flight 372. The change in the atmosphere was immediate and profound. Despite wearing a simple charcoal suit rather than a uniform, despite having no visible symbols of authority, Dominic's presence filled the cabin with an almost physical force. At 6'2", with shoulders broadened by years of early morning workouts, he cut an imposing figure. But it was his eyes, dark penetrating and currently cold with controlled fury, that commanded attention. "Captain Wilson," he acknowledged with a slight nod, his deep voice betraying no emotion. "Ms. Collins, Mr. Brooks." They murmured responses that sounded feeble even to their own ears. Dominic surveyed them for a long moment, saying nothing, allowing the silence to build until it became almost unbearable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried to every corner of the cabin. 25 years ago, I founded this airline with a simple principle: every passenger deserves respect, dignity, and fair treatment. It's in our mission statement. It's in our training manuals. It's in every speech I've given to every employee, from baggage handlers to board members. He paused, his gaze moving from one crew member to the next, assessing, evaluating. Today on this aircraft, that principle was not just forgotten, it was deliberately abandoned. And I want to understand why. Captain Wilson stepped forward slightly, his professional instinct to protect his crew overriding his personal apprehension. "Sir, we followed established security protocols. The lead flight attendant reported a passenger disturbance, and as captain, I made the determination that—" "Did you leave the cockpit to assess the situation yourself?" Dominic interrupted, his tone still measured, but with an edge that cut like a blade. Wilson hesitated. "No, sir. That's not standard. Did you request verification beyond Ms. Collins' assessment? Did you ask for corroborating statements from other passengers? Did you review any evidence before authorizing the removal of a paying customer from this aircraft?" Each question struck with precision, leaving no room for equivocation. No, Sir Wilson admitted, his earlier confidence crumbling. Dominic turned his attention to Rachel Collins. "Ms. Collins, when the passenger in 14B claimed she felt unsafe, what steps did you take to verify her allegations?" Rachel swallowed hard. I observed the passenger in 14A and determined that her behavior warranted—" "What behavior specifically?" Dominic pressed. She was argumentative when questioned, and there was concern about unauthorized recording. Argumentative, Dominic repeated the word, hanging in the air. "Ms. Collins, I've seen a video of the entire incident. The passenger you removed was calm, composed, and entirely reasonable given the circumstances. She explained that her phone had fallen and showed you her locked screen. At what point did that justify labeling her a security risk?" Rachel had no answer. Thomas Brooks, perhaps sensing the inevitable, attempted to salvage what he could. "Sir, by the time I was called to the aircraft, the situation had already been assessed by the flight crew. My role was simply to execute the removal as directed by the captain." Execution without question. Dominic noted, his gaze shifting to the gate agent. Blind obedience rather than basic human judgment. Is that what Skyline has become in my absence from day-to-day operations? The question wasn't directed at Brooks alone, but at all of them, at the culture that had allowed this incident to occur. In the silence that followed, Janet Rivera stepped forward slightly. "The passenger from 14B, Elizabeth Parker, has been isolated as you requested. The witness from 2B, Olivia Bennett, is waiting in the private conference room with her video evidence. And the young man from 14C, Miguel Ramirez, is being interviewed now." Dominic nodded, then turned back to the crew. "In a few minutes, I'm going to ask each of you to provide your account of what happened. Not your justifications or your procedures, what actually happened, but before that, there's something you should know." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that seemed to press the air from the cabin. "The passenger you removed, the young woman you labeled a security risk without evidence or due process, is my daughter, Jasmine Reynolds." The revelation fell like a thunderbolt among the crew. Captain Wilson actually took a physical step backward, as if struck. Rachel's hand flew to her mouth. Heather let out a small, involuntary sound of distress. "But that's not why I'm here." Dominic continued his control absolute despite the emotion vibrating beneath his words. "I'm here because what happened on this aircraft represents a fundamental betrayal of everything Skyline Airways claims to stand for. And that betrayal would be just as inexcusable if the passenger had been a stranger, rather than my daughter." He glanced at his watch, then back at the stunned crew. "You have 5 minutes to collect your thoughts. Then we're going to get to the bottom of exactly how and why this happened. And then, and only then, will we discuss the consequences." As Dominic turned to confer with Janet and Andrew, the crew exchanged glances of pure dread. They had followed protocol, yes, but in doing so they had failed to follow something far more important: basic human decency and fairness. And now, in the stark light of accountability, that failure stood exposed for exactly what it was. The jet bridge to Gate B-42 had been cleared of all regular personnel, replaced by Skyline Airways corporate security, and a small team of executives who formed a corridor of silent authority. Through this gauntlet walked Dominic Reynolds, his presence commanding attention without effort. Unlike some CEOs who cultivated an image of unapproachable power, Dominic's authority came from a different source. Employees who had worked with him often described the same quality and intense focus that made whoever he was speaking with feel like the only person in the room. That focus, now directed toward the matter at hand, had transformed the typically bustling airport gate into a space of hushed anticipation. At 52, he moved with the confidence of a man who had built an empire through sheer force of will and uncompromising principles. The charcoal suit he wore bore no flashy labels, just impeccable tailoring that spoke of quiet wealth. The only hint of color was the signature Skyline blue pocket square, a small nod to the company whose name he had made synonymous with excellence. Behind his composed exterior, Dominic's mind was anything but calm. The video he had watched aboard his corporate jet had awakened something primal, the protective instinct of a father seeing his child mistreated. But even stronger was his sense of betrayal. The airline he had built, the company that bore his name and embodied his values, had utterly failed not just his daughter, but its own foundational principles. Flanking him were Janet Rivera, his chief operating officer, and Andrew Patterson, his chief legal counsel, both longtime confidants who had weathered countless corporate storms at his side. Their expressions were professionally neutral, but the gravity of their purpose was evident in their focused stride and the files clutched in their hands. As they approached the aircraft door, Alfonso Garcia, the JFK operations director, stepped forward nervously. "Mr. Reynolds, everything has been arranged as requested. The passengers have been relocated to the premium lounge with complimentary refreshments and travel vouchers. The witnesses you specified have been separated for individual interviews." Dominic acknowledged this with a slight nod. "And my daughter, Ms. Reynolds, has been escorted to the executive suite in Terminal 4. A security detail is with her as requested. Thank you, Alfonso." Dominic's tone was polite but distant, his mind clearly focused on the task ahead. Before boarding the aircraft, he paused, turning to Janet and Andrew. "This isn't just about Jasmine," he said quietly. "This is about what Skyline Airways has become when I wasn't looking. We're going to correct that today, starting with this flight." They nodded in understanding. This wasn't a father seeking retribution, though that element certainly existed. This was the CEO addressing a fundamental failure in his company's culture. A memory surfaced, Dominic teaching 5-year-old Jasmine to ride a bicycle in the park near their Chicago home. She had fallen skinning her knee and looked up at him with tears threatening, but held back by sheer determination. "Does it hurt, Jazz?" he had asked. "Yes," she had replied. "But I'm not done riding yet." That resilience, that quiet dignity in the face of pain, had always been her defining quality. The image of her maintaining that same composure while being falsely accused and publicly humiliated strengthened his resolve. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about ensuring such a failure never happened again. As they stepped onto the aircraft, the usual bustling energy of a cabin during turnaround was replaced by a tense silence. The flight crew stood in a loose formation in the first-class section, their expressions ranging from apprehension to outright fear. Dominic took them in with one sweep of his gaze. Captain James Wilson, a 27-year veteran with an otherwise spotless record. Rachel Collins, the lead flight attendant whose mishandling of the situation had set events in motion. Heather Davidson, the flight attendant who had first responded to Elizabeth Parker's complaint. Thomas Brooks, the gate agent who had executed the removal without question. They were not evil people, Dominic knew. They were products of a system that had somehow drifted from its foundational values, a system that had allowed bias to masquerade as security protocol. Captain Wilson, he acknowledged with a slight nod, then addressed each crew member by name. The simple act of recognition causing some to straighten their posture and others to pale further. When he finally spoke to the group, his voice was quiet but carried effortlessly throughout the cabin. 25 years ago, I founded this airline with a simple principle. Every passenger deserves respect, dignity, and fair treatment. It's in our mission statement. It's in our training manuals. It's in every speech I've given to every employee from baggage handlers to board members. He paused, allowing the weight of this reminder to settle on them. Today on this aircraft, that principle was not just forgotten, it was deliberately abandoned. And I want to understand why. What followed was a methodical dismantling of their justifications. Captain Wilson admitted he had never left the cockpit to assess the situation himself. Rachel Collins struggled to articulate specific behaviors that warranted removing Jasmine. Thomas Brooks confessed to executing the removal without questioning its basis. When Dominic revealed that the passenger they had removed was his daughter, the shock that rippled through the crew was palpable. But his next statement struck even deeper. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because what happened on this aircraft represents a fundamental betrayal of everything Skyline Airways claims to stand for. And that betrayal would be just as inexcusable if the passenger had been a stranger rather than my daughter. After giving them 5 minutes to collect their thoughts, Dominic turned to Janet. Let's proceed with the interviews. Captain Wilson first in the forward galley. The others can wait in the rear galley with corporate security. As the crew dispersed, Andrew opened his portfolio and removed a tablet. You should see this before we start, he said, pulling up the video that Olivia Bennett had recorded. Dominic watched it in silence, his jaw tightening as he witnessed his daughter's dignity in the face of such treatment. When it ended, he handed the tablet back to Andrew. Make sure this is preserved and authenticated, he instructed. It's going to be central to what follows. Janet touched his arm lightly. Dominic, what exactly are we doing here? Disciplinary action policy revision. Dominic looked at her, his expression resolute. Both. And more. Today we're reminding everyone from the crew of this aircraft, to every employee in the Skyline network of exactly who we are and what we stand for. And we're ensuring this never happens again. With that, he moved toward the forward galley where Captain Wilson waited, his captain's hat held in hands that couldn't quite disguise their trembling. The reckoning had begun. If this story moved you, please don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed it, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that inspire change. Your support helps us continue creating content that matters. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message about dignity, respect, and the courage to stand up for what's right. Together we can create a world where everyone is treated with the dignity they deserve, regardless of who they are. Thank you for watching.